Everyone has heard of King John, the tyrant forced to go to war with his barons, leading to the signing of the Magna Carta. People probably know him from Robin Hood or other Hollywood productions, but I'm not here to delve into the realms of mythology, hearsay or legend. My mission is to unveil the man behind the myth. Who was King John? John has just lost the continent for a second time, the final time. Since his initial defeat all those years ago, John never really returned outside a couple of brief, failed invasions. But here, at his most recent defeat, he blamed the many knights and magnates that refused to muster. If no military service was given in France, then John would get back scutage from every knight who owed it. But in the meantime, other, more pressing matters would have to be taken care of first. A 3-year truce, plus 11,000 marks, was agreed between Philip of France and John of England. Though a certain English-born cardinal by the name of Robert de Courson was not helping the matter. A theologian who taught in Paris and a perfect choice as ambassador during these times. He was a papal legate, a big hitter in politics. Unfortunately, Robert de Courson was insolent and only antagonised the French, forcing the Pope to send him angry letters, returning him with the king to England. Later, next year, he'd be boycotted by the French clergy, and he'd threaten them with excommunication. Not a great start for the Lateran Council that was to be held in 1215 the next year. Outside of this silliness, there is more talk of a foreign invasion from France, as Philip presses his advantage despite the truce. From France, where John currently resides. He's on the coast. He sends agents across England in mid-August, commandeering the castles on the east coast of England. Peter de Roche is strengthening castles in Northumberland, ordering Philip of Oldcoast to carry this out. King John doesn't return to England until October the 13th. He doesn't land at Portsmouth, instead Dartmouth, all the way in Devon. From there, slipping into Corfe Castle. Once he'd regained his wits, about a week later, he headed for London and was there by the 29th of October. From the famous tower where he resided, John formulated a plan. He sent crossbowmen to Corfe, Windsor and Nottingham. 20,000 crossbow bolts were sent to Marlborough Castle alone. And then he waited. But nothing happened. And in November, Robert Fitzwalter, the rebel, meets with John. Things seem okay between them, unlike Eustace de Vesey, who was still being a pariah. John even brought the matter to the Pope in the Courier, that de Vesey was being a pain in the backside, and the papacy seems to be on John's side. After all, he's becoming the Pope's golden boy. So John organises a meeting in mid-November, 1214, at the house of the Knights Templar in London. Matters with the barons and clergy both needed to be settled, and it wasn't going to go well. Everyone had a grievance with John. Papal intervention demanded John pay 100,000 marks for being an absolute cockwomble. Negotiable, but expensive nonetheless. Right, a lot happens here, so bear with me while I explain what occurs at this November Council. Now, here people talk more about the interdict still not being lifted The clergy still needing payment. The excommunicated stubborn old king under strict interdict, that's long gone. This is more the church going on strike until they get compensation from the king looting the churches. No doubt also clinging to their leverage over the king. Either way, John ends up having to pay a further 40,000 marks in 6 monthly instalments to finally end this new problem. But finally, everything, and yes, everything, was at last concluded. I would say this may have sorted things out. But King John? He had no plans on paying back the clergy, merely lip service. He didn't want them whipping up rebels among the magnates. Add to this, going by the chroniclers, quite a few senior clergy members had passed away recently, replaced by younger men with younger ideas. And not that John is old, by the way, he's only around 47 years of age, but still, things are changing. One of the clergy that left this world was John de Grey, the Bishop of Norwich and the Justiciar of Ireland. He died in October. John's obsession with making him Archbishop of Canterbury over Stephen Langton caused the whole interdict problem in the first place. John de Grey was buried at Norwich Cathedral. And the Pope gives Nicholas of Tusculum powers to elect these new bishops, thus avoiding more controversy with the Church. And this legate, Nicholas, pretty much run roughshod over England, overruling everyone in a way, and executing the Pope's mandate. Not as in he killed the Pope's mandate, the Pope had a mandate which Nicholas executed. Just going to clarify that. And this mandate just happened to be the one supported by the king. Bribery was needed to soothe the clergy from getting a bit too irate. The king was also willing to have a charter written up, giving his word that the cathedrals and monasteries would be exempt from royal interference. Right, first matter concluded. And we're still in November 1214. It's about to get worse. It wasn't just the clergy that were present at this time, as 7 earls, possibly more, and many barons witnessed this charter. The king was signing a charter, a literal contract between himself and the church. They were reining him in. So, imagine the cogs turning in these magnates' heads. If the church could pull this off, why couldn't they? These magnates were already at wit's end with the king. It's nothing new. All kings had written up contracts between themselves and the magnates. John signed one in 1199. But Stephen Langton had already found the coronation charter of Henry I, and he soon made the barons aware. A document written around 115 years prior and consisted of 13 clauses. As was traditional for the era, most of these clauses were obsolete by the time of John, written for Henry I's time and none other. However, Langton had noticed a couple of good little rules that certainly resonated among the magnates of today. Firstly, the promise that when a baron dies owing money, the amount he pays back should be just and lawful. Unlike John, who frankly was taking the piss. There was also the promise that should a baroness be widowed, the king should not intervene in future marriage, not without her consent. Then there was the clause that Henry I promised to abolish all evil customs to which England had been unjustly repressed. All these matters greatly affected current affairs. John had openly abused his right as king in these matters alone. The magnates must have felt a pang in their stomachs. Over a century ago, the barons had it easy, while now it was like a biblical Old Testament tyrant. It was time for a change. So, in this November council of 1214, the barons presented John with this old charter, demanding he reissue it, hoping it would alleviate their problems. Though even if the king did agree, there was no mention of the abuse of scutage or military service. However, that last clause I mentioned, about abolishing unjust laws, interpreted right and written correctly, could suggest room for reform. There was a lot of wiggle room here, and they planned on making John wriggle. Unfortunately, John didn't earn the name Softsword for no reason. He was no warrior, but a political strategist. He saw straight through this blatant attempt to curb his power. He simply postponed all hearing of it until the new year. Meanwhile, the king silently, no doubt using those he deemed loyal, began to order the construction of new siege engines. And John never failed a siege, apart from Rashomon. A new board had been set, a new game, an old opponent. So, in this November council, once the matter with the clergy has been concluded, John simply left the barons in the lurch and buggered off out of London to go hunting in the West Country. Starting in Wiltshire, ending up in Dorset. What a blighter! What could the barons do except hope that Christmas Court would yield better results? In the meantime, fellow conspirators, led by none other than Fitzwalter himself, met at the Abbey at Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk. Even the Northerners, led by Eustace de Vesey, had turned up. This was big. They were planning war on the king should he refuse this charter. They did not want this. Surely John would see reason. Multiple chroniclers confirm this. Everyone important who had grievance was here, including the young baron forced to marry John's middle-aged ex-wife Isabella of Gloucester, and pay 20,000 marks for the privilege. All who had grievance with the king, they were all here. I will briefly mention another event not related to this particular part in John's life, but relevant as a whole and regarding people we've come across in other parts of this series. William the Lion of Scotland, ill and frail, passes away just before Christmas at the venerable age of 72. He'd sat on the throne for almost 50 years, half a century, and the crown now passes to his son Alexander, the young lad that John had knighted previously. Now, back to John. People say John was in Worcester. And yes, for the American viewers, Worcester. And for the source, Worcestershire. Like Lord of the Rings, Shire, Worcestershire. Though it's not like we actually pronounce it like that either. Worcestershire, that's what we call it, Worcestershire. Worcestershire sauce. Right, it's settled. Carrying on. So, at Christmas, the king held court at Worcester for barely a day, according to Roger at Wendover, before heading to London for the big feast. There, John would have to face the barons. But what greeted him at the Temple in London on the 6th of January, even he wasn't expecting. Fitzwater and his rebels had arrived for war. Imagine this. Each and every person here, magnate to peasant, were openly opposing not only the king, but a tyrannical psychopath. Easily the biggest decision of their lives. Yet they were here. The cheeky buggers had more or less formed a union and had come up with some demands. They demanded Henry I's charter was reaffirmed. Failing that, war. No one here wanted war. Surely John would see reason. And amendments had been made to the old charter, 12 additional clauses. Mainly regarding wardship and marriage. But now, the royal forests were to be reduced, and punishments downgraded, laws about Jews and money lending, laws about trials and punishments. All the barons were adding their own. Oh, and there was more. Scutage was to be capped, one measly mark. If the king wanted more, he'll have to obtain permission from the barons. An outrage. Military service, oh, now that was limited only to England, Normandy and Brittany, not France or other vanity projects. Take in mind that, yes, these days Normandy is in France, but back in the 13th century, Philip had only just conquered it. The English still considered it theirs. Ever since William the Conqueror's northern ancestors first obtained it, it had been coveted. It was merely under French occupation, as far as the barons were concerned. But fighting in Poitou, Anjou, Gascony, John could go to hell. This was not their fight. The barons were not playing John's games of strategy. They had pulled the rug from underneath him, sending the proverbial pieces scattering to the floor. They'd even began this new charter with the announcement that King John concedes. Did he bunnies? He agreed on nothing of the sort. This was just a random unknown charter that the barons had written up themselves, no different than a group of peasants agreeing on the changing when the sun sets. John had a God-given right to absolute rule. He was not going to sit here and be dictated to by all and sundry. If anything, it was his right to write a charter demanding they cease their demands. This he did, but only a couple of barons agreed to it, Ranulph de Blondeville, William Brewer and Pierre de Roche. Sides were slowly being drawn, and this fiery debate raged on for a whole week, with tempers flaring between the king and his subjects. All attempts at putting off the meeting were thwarted by the barons, who were determined to get this matter done with. But eventually John gets his way, and another meeting is put off until Pasach, which is Easter. The Marshal, Stephen Langton, and the Bishop of Ely swore the king would hold his word. It was their oath. A brief note here. The Bishop of Ely was Eustace, but he dies just weeks later in Reading, the bishopric passing to Geoffrey de Burgh. A controversial decision in the eyes of the Pope. In the next decade, he'll have his bishopric blocked and nullified twice by Honorius III, and finally getting it in 1225, but currently in 1215 is Innocent III is the Pope, and all is well and good in Ely. But the previous bishop swore the oath, not this one, so it ends up being just Marshal and Langton holding the king's word. Nevermore had the king been so desperate. This time it wasn't merely a couple of conspirators opposing him. It was the same conspirators after they'd rallied most of the other barons to their banner. a banner raised for war, should John not cave in to their impudent demands. The king retreats to Guildford. He's there a week before heading to the south coast. There, having no stomach for debate, he made plans to give the barons exactly what they wanted, and he prepared for war. He dispatched troops to loyal sheriffs in Nottingham and Northumberland. He raided castles all over the kingdom. In response to this abomination of a charter, John wanted new oaths of loyalty from his barons. He demanded all oppose this charter. But this proved highly unpopular, so the king abandons that. In a world full of enemies, he only had one friend, Pope Innocent III. And John had one last trick up his sleeve. As the date to Easter approached, he headed to London and holed himself up in the Tower, then sent envoys to the Curia. King John had taken the cross. Yes, the wily git had managed to wriggle free out of yet another tight spot. Now no one can harm him. A holy, crusading king, just like his brother Richard before him. A masterstroke, after all. Pope Innocent III had been talking about a possible fifth crusade for a while now. After the disastrous fourth one, when Constantinople was sacked. This was another attempt to retake the Holy Land, though we all know John had no plans to actually go ahead with any of this. It was clearly just a tactic to outmaneuver his baronial opponents. But said baronial opponents saw right through this charade, and despite all John's promises to be like his crusading brother, he was secretly importing foreign troops from loyal parts of Poitou. They were currently massing in Ireland under everyone's noses. Another meeting in March ended in arguments, and all barons, loyal and otherwise, retreated back to their castles. Easter fast approached, and peace had never looked further away. And when Easter finally arrived, and all the barons had arrived in Northampton to discuss the charter, John was nowhere to be seen. He was safely in his tower in London, celebrating the Easter feast before buggering off to Corfe Castle, a slap in the face for all. William Marshal and Langton were sent in his place, but what could they do? All that was known about this meeting is that it was held somewhere between Oxford and Northampton, and the agenda takes a turn for the worse for John. This charter clearly wasn't going to solve anything. It began to evolve into something much greater. And if the king didn't sign this one with his own royal seal, they'd declare war and take his castles one by one. When John hears of this, he apparently exclaimed, "Why don't they take my kingdom as well?" He heads for Oxfordshire, but not before enabling troops for war, including many Welsh, should the barons not cease their insolence. Only then did he meet the barons, and only with envoys from the Pope. John was wanting a 3-month truce. He puts blame on the barons for all the political chaos. He further blamed the Marshal and Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, for not being able to handle the rebellion. While everyone around him was enraged, the letters John sent around were calm and peaceful. He was setting himself up, visibly, as the good guy. And all the barons had to do for the kindly king to forgive them was to accept his compassion, his fealty. They would not. They renounced fealty and openly declared hostility. The kingdom quickly descended into chaos. John swiftly put William Marshal, ever loyal to the throne, and the newly arrived from his captivity in France, the Earl of Salisbury, his half-brother, William Longsby. Both these men were given the task of readying the royal castles, and if there was one thing John was good at, it was a siege. He's got a bloody good track record. Meanwhile, the king himself heads for London to secure the capital. This time for the House of the Templars in Temple. He'd arrived there on the 9th of May. Though he wasn't there long, and soon would be on the move again, heading for Windsor, where he planned to head his operations. Remember those extortionate inheritance taxes John placed on some of his magnates? Well, now we see a method to his madness. For now he plans to lax these charges. Richard de Manville is set to pay 20,000 marks, now less. Very enticing for a young nobleman deep in debt. And remember William de Braose? Well, his surviving son Giles? He's got his family lands back. Isn't John kind? It was the last chance saloon, the last roll of the dice. He must have felt like a rat that escaped its cage, scurrying around from castle to castle, ducking all that attempted to grab him. Stephen Langton, being the only keeper of peace in these chaotic times, mediating between the two sides. John was wishing to have another look at the older, unknown charter that was based on Henry I's old rules. He probably wished he signed that, rather than this new monster that was being concocted by his unruly barons. The barons rather liked this new charter. Oh, they'd do anything to get the king to sign it. But these rebels were no disorganised rabble, no. They were led by the magnate Robert Fitzwalter, the Marshal of the Army of God and the Holy Church, a new title the barons had made up for him. An army made up of barons and knights. Now, this was no civil war, but a baronial revolt. Although John's forces were growing, and his foreign knights were arriving to meet him in Winchester, along with his Flemish mercenaries, the table was tipping in John's favour. John also had all the siege engines. The barons didn't. Hence, when Robert Fitzwalter sieges Northampton Castle, it holds out. His standard bearer is slain by a crossbow bolt to the head. Nasty. Just over a week later, he abandons this and heads to another castle, Bedford, where the garrison had just defected to the rebels. More good news for the rebels. A faction from London had also just defected. So Fitzwalter rode from Bedford to London to meet them. They took the direct route, stopping in Weir. They arrived at the capital soon after, on the 17th of May, a Sunday. John had already secured the royal metropolis, or at least he thought, for Fitzwalter's rebels were snuck in the city with aid from his new metropolitan allies. He waited till everyone was at mass before striking. The rebels attacked all the royal strongholds, sacking and looting as they went. They even turned on the Jews, destroying their houses and using the stone to build new fortifications, capturing the king's supporters and taking control of the treasury. London had fallen. Only the Tower held out, but it was the long defeat, as the rebels begun building siege engines and other engines of war. The city belonged to Fitzwalter. John probably wished he'd kept the treasury out of London, like he did before. He'd always suspected something like this would happen. Now, the only money he had was the roaming exchequer that Peter de Roche ran about 5 years ago, and even that was nearly empty. John had always relied on his Flemish mercenaries, but mercenaries don't work for free. Their loyalty is round and shiny. John didn't have the funds. Yet. Thankfully, the Flemish held their end of the bargain. They'd stay loyal. After all, they'd been campaigning with the king for as long as they could remember. they were as much part of the English army as anybody else. And all the while, Fitzwalter had organised his rebels into 4 different armies. Thanks to the fall of London, his support, and support for this new charter, was growing. Fathers joined sons, uncles joined nephews. All the barons, save for a few, had defected to the rebels' cause. According to Coggeshal, all bar de Warenne, Arundel, William Marshall, Ranulph de Blondeville, William Longspur and a few others. These were the only ones that were loyal. All support for the king was evaporating. This was no longer a holy army, but a movement. Political reform, real political reform, was at last within Fitzwalter's reach. Uprisings were breaking out all over the country. Even the castle at Lincoln was put under siege. To the distress of the ageing Nicola de la Haye, her husband, Gerard de Canville, had died the previous year, leaving her a widow. She'd kept her titles and was staunchly loyal to John. She'd already proven herself good in a siege, and this would be no exception. Lincoln would hold out. In Devon, meanwhile, the Flemish mercenaries had beaten one of the rebel armies, but they were proving stubborn, and were renewing their attacks, taking royal strongholds. And then you had the Welsh. Llewellyn had raised an army, and invaded Shropshire. Oh, and the Scots, led by young King Alexander II, no doubt resentful from all the years he had spent away from his father as a hostage of King John. Even the French had pledged support for the barons, though this time, if Philip planned an invasion into England, he'd be greeted by Robert Fitzwalter's holy army with open arms. John's house of cards was collapsing. This time, there was no way out. The rat was cornered. His enemies were harnessed for war. There was no way of gnawing through these proverbial ropes. They'd got him. He was in check and mate. There was no choice other than to topple his peace in surrender. A treaty enabled by Stephen Langton. Once John's enemy, now his saviour. After several weeks of back and forth negotiation, a new meeting between the barons is arranged, and this time the king would have to accept it. They'd meet at the historical field at Runnymede. This they did on the 10th of June, 1215. There were pavilions at one end of the field and smaller tents as far as the eye could see. A huge multitude was here. The turnout had been pretty great. Many famous and renowned knights had arrived from all over the place. You just know there would have been feasts. You could just smell the hog roasts, all the ale. It seemed that everyone had recognised this was an historical occasion. John had turned up with a great bodyguard, for all it was worth. But unlike all those times before, the two sides started talking, with Stephen Langton mediating between the factions. Diplomacy was at last underway. The Articles of the Barons. A new document written up as part of an attempt to stop all-out war and a serious attempt to reform the powers of the king, effectively an evolution of the discarded Unknown Charter. Henry I sold one long gone. John was no doubt familiar with many of the terms and clauses that had been written up over the last few months, but the barons kept on adding their own demands, and by now a further 49 clauses had been added. This the king sealed, but it was only a pathway to the next step. This was the monster that Fitzwalter had wanted John to sign. But by now, it was already obsolete, and another charter would be required, one that wasn't just a rehash of a century-old document. This one would be a well-thought-out document that wouldn't just affect John, but kings to come. A great charter. Magna Carta. Latin. Magna meaning great, and Carta being the charter. The Great Charter. Many of the previous clauses from the Unknown and the Articles were still here, albeit rewritten and reworded, such as the scutage and the royal forests, liberally written and given the barons considerable powers. It was issued 5 days later, and they demanded the king sign it. But by this time, it wasn't just about grievances between the king and the barons, and which noble owed what, and how the king needed permission to take it. Now, it also affected the general public, the peasants both servile and free. Weights and Measures Acts. Toll collectors who trolled the river's fishermen were stamped out. Merchants were able to travel freely throughout the kingdom without any of these evil tolls. There was more good news. Ale now had to be issued to a specific measure. Hammering miscreants bent on serving less quantities. Clause 35 of the Magna Carta demands the measures of ale, wine and corn, known as the London Quarter. Apparently, a measure of ale should be around 2 pints. I might have to bring this up at the local pub. Though, alas, only 3 of the 63 clauses are used today. Freedom of the church, the right to a fair trial, and the ancient liberties of the City of London. But nice to know that this 800-year-old document still applies somewhat today, even if the old girl has seen some modern amendments over the years. Rather than go into detail about the 63 clauses, I'd rather continue with a general history of King John. I do recommend checking out the Magna Carta online. There are many good websites that list these 63 clauses, and many a good book for people like myself who prefer to sit in a local pub with a nice pint of ale while reading. But there was also the curious case of Clause 50. Gerard d'Arthy had been given powers to eliminate William de Braose. D'Arthy was a foreigner, and he'd been dead a few years now, as was de Braose. But his friends and relatives from the Loire Valley, utter scallywags, hadn't got the memo. Now, they weren't scallywags because they were evildoers. It's more they didn't understand our terms, our customs. They were French. So this clause not only removed them from office, but banned any foreigner unfamiliar with English customs from holding office too. These were serious reforms. The Magna Carta was issued as a legally binding contract between the king and the barons. Once his seal was stamped on the wax, it was written, therefore shall be done. But still he refused. It is unknown exactly how these talks between the two factions went. Aside from the king not being present, he was at nearby Windsor, using his ides as mouthpieces. We can only speculate as to who did what, and said what at this historic gathering at Runnymede. What is known is that John suggested that both factions, royal and rebel, choose 4 men to conduct the negotiations, though whether this was actually carried out is anyone's guess. For 5 days, the negotiations went on. Still, John refused to sign the charter. Then, towards the end, the rebels took things further. 25 barons were elected to hold the king to account, and it only required 4 of them to report breaches of the charter, and should the king further breach his oath, then all 25 barons under Fitzwalter's Holy Army would seize the king's castles. This last part proved too controversial, and John did not like it. But these rules were not currently written on parchment. John reckoned he could rush to Runnymede and sign the Magna Carta before it got further out of hand. And this he did on the 15th of June, 1215. But, like every promise John had ever made, he had no intention of ever obeying the Magna Carta. He didn't care if his seal was stamped or not. He'd do anything in his power to undo this ruin.